Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for north central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, friends. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Thanks for joining the conversation, and thanks for your ongoing support of Lakeland Public TV. Although we cherish the beautiful part of the world in which we live, many of us may not be aware of the fact that there are several acutely polluted sites in our region also. One of them is known as the St. Regis Superfund site right here in the heart of the Leech Lake Nation in Cass Lake, Minnesota. And here to help us understand what a Superfund site is, the environmental health implications, and the status of the cleanup effort is my guest and the leading expert on the matter, John Purcell. John Purcell served for nearly 20 years as a water quality specialist for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and has also served several terms in the Minnesota House of Representatives since 2008. John, welcome to the program and thanks for making time for our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's good to see you again. I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. I was wondering if we could start with a big picture, and I was wondering if you could explain to our viewers just what a Superfund site is. For those of us that aren't familiar with that term, what's a Superfund site?
Well, it is a site that is federally or state listed under the federal law. CERCLA is the acronym, CERCLA, which was set up 40 some years ago, darn near 50 years ago. I don't have the exact date, but it almost is the same date that I started, and you introduced me as 20 years. It was 41 years I spent looking at this site and working as a water quality specialist for tribal government. So yeah, no problem. I only say that though because I go back to nearly the beginning of when this site was recognized. And there are Superfund sites all across the United States. There are quite a few of them in Minnesota, many in metropolitan areas, but there are a couple of them in our area here, as you indicated. I talk about the St. Regis site specifically.
Yeah, so that was actually my next question for
you.
I'm curious if you can you tell us what exactly was it that happened to create the St. Regis Superfund site? In other words, was this an incident that happened in a brief period of time, or is it something that happened over a longer period of time? Tell us the history of this site.
Very good. The history of the St. Regis Superfund site, and the name of it is St. Regis comes from St. Regis Paper Company, and this site located over in Cass Lake, and it has to do with railroad tracks because timber was hauled in on railroad tracks and by truck, but primarily railroad tracks back in the day. This would have been back in the late 40s. And early 50s, and there was a wood treatment facility. They didn't make paper over there in Cass Lake at the St. Regis site, but they treated lumber, poles and posts primarily starting with, and then a little bit of lumber later on, and it was treated with several different chemicals. Some folks have maybe heard of copper chromium arsenate. That was one that was used. The most detrimental chemical that was used was pentachlorophenol, and it's detrimental in itself. And it pressure treated, injected pentachlorophenol into the posts or poles, and that were being treated. And let me back up just a second. Prior to posts and poles being treated with pentachlorophenol or copper chromium arsenate, they were treated with creosote. And I think many people from back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, myself, I know I remember seeing a lot of posts and poles that just had creosote on them. that was also used at this site. And creosote, when it gets in the ground and groundwater, that's a fairly obnoxious group of chemicals itself. But by far the most problematic is pentachlorophenol, and pentachlorophenol contains the chemical, the several chemicals called dioxins, and those are I don't want to get too technical here, but there are 17 varieties of those dioxins and furans, and a couple of those varieties, which we chemists call congeners, are the most toxic substances known to man. And they got in the groundwater and the soil, and of course, people used to live over there on the south side of Cass Lake. And kids used to play in ponds over there, water ponds that accumulated water from the site. So there were some really obnoxious experiences there with the chemicals. So I go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, so pentachlorophenol, if I said that correctly, for those of us that aren't chemists, can you tell us what are the human health consequences of exposure to both that particular compound as well as the 17 other varieties of dioxins that you mentioned? What are the environmental health consequences that we're talking about here in the community?
And they largely fall into a category of endocrine disruptors, and so they can cause anything from birth defects, fetal impacts, causing birth defects, etc., through your endocrine system. I mean, anything to do with our human body can be impacted. I mean, your kidney infections, things like that, and then on to cancer, of course, is one of the also potential outcomes of that.
So let me understand this. So there was a company that was treating holes and piles, I believe you said, in Cass Lake using these various compounds. How long did that go on?
They operated from the late 40s, as I recall. I don't have all of the specifics in front of me. I apologize for that, but from approximately the late 40s until I believe it was 82 or so, early 80s, when they were brought under the Superfund law and ordered to shut down and begin cleaning up the area. And we're still working on that cleanup. And there's groundwater, as I indicated, under the site and in many adjacent areas is significantly contaminated with various substances. And so that's being pumped and treated and then discharged into the surface waters of Cass Lake and Pike Bay, which is problematic in and of itself. So
interesting. Well, I certainly want to talk about the cleanup effort, but I guess I still want to better understand exactly how this came to be. So if the St. Regis company was doing this treatment in Cass Lake, at that time, how were they treating the effluent, or how did the exposure take place, essentially?
Well, they unfortunately, back in 50s, 60s, even 70s, there wasn't a lot of regulations on many companies. And I would just remind listeners that may recall the Cuyahoga River starting on fire. And I'm trying to remember the year of that, 68, 69, somewhere in there. And that's the classic example of no environmental quality regulations at that time. As the environmental quality regulations came into play, then many of these facilities were forced to shut down. There just wasn't economically feasible for them to keep operating. And that's the case of the St. Regis site. That there were other ways that were developed to treat posts and poles, and they came under environmental regulation. So what we were left here in Cass Lake was a significant mess, just a big mess. There had been the groundwater is 6-8 feet beneath the surface in this area, along basically south of the railroad tracks there, and there were pits that were dug. Of course, they filled up with water, and those pits were used for the disposal of waste from the treatment facility, and waste was taken out in what I would describe as a spraying machine that you might see used in a farm situation, agriculture situation, where a farmer might spray some kind of an insecticide or something on a corn crop, for instance. Back in the day, now this is a big tank, and then this was sprayed around the area there wherever it was open, and that just spread these chemicals out and polluted the groundwater in a significant area. And the city of Cass Lake's well had to be moved early on in this process. They had to go west, upstream as the groundwater would flows, and put in a new well because their well was contaminated.
So let me just paraphrase to make sure I understand. The St. Regis Paper Company was treating the poles and piles in open lagoons, and then was also dispersing the effluents through this spraying apparatus that you're talking about. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, and there's another. They also were hooked up to the city sewer, which was problematic because that went to Fox Creek, which is a creek that borders the south perimeter of the site, and the primary treatment sewer facility, so it didn't treat any of these chemicals. Basically removed some sludges, from the sewer that came from the city mainly.
Sure.
But this got out into Pike Bay, and Pike Bay's connected to Cass Lake. That's another way that contamination was spread around the area in the aquatic ecosystem.
So you've mentioned several environmental health risks, the impact on the endocrine system, the possibility of birth defects. If the well water had actually been contaminated to the extent that it needed to be moved, I guess my next question for you is, were there documentable, measurable health consequences in the community? Has the community seen a high rate of birth defects or cancer rates?
Certainly there was some of that. I mean, and depending on who you talk to, a lot of folks that lived on the south side where this treatment plant was moved, and there was housing, and this was in primarily a Native American community. There were some white folks there too, but as new housing was developed north of Highway 2 and what's commonly known as Track 33, Track 34, folks were able to move and move out of that area and be in a safer area. And so that did happen as well. And much of that property was never, the houses were torn down, and there's been a conscious effort, even by international paper, there's a conscious effort for them to buy up properties as they've become available, and they paid some pretty good money for some properties, and they actually tried to have asked the city to change the zoning for some of these residential properties. This is over the last several decades now. Change the zoning from residential to commercial, so that they're wouldn't be able to have people live there. And this is a real issue for the city too. I mean, the community, because housing is so much needed, and that area, much of that area could be used for housing. It really could, whether it's apartments or just just single family dwellings. But the soils need to be cleaned up. We've got another cleanup coming. This has been done in phases. The cleanup has over the years, and there's another cleanup coming. It's been in the works for a handful of years now, and we hope, maybe by 2025 we'll get it done. A soil cleanup.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's quite perplexing when you look at it for decades as I have and others have. Why isn't this just cleaned up? And of course the tribe wants to take that contamination off the reservation, and then instead of they're storing some of that contaminated soil and sludges in a lined vault, as it were, and that's got monitoring wells around it, and it's not leaking, but it's not gonna stay that way forever. And so there's some real problems that have been created in the cleanup by itself.
I'm eager to learn about how this is cleaned up, but I have one more question regarding the history of this issue, which is both you and I have already mentioned that this is taking place in the heart of the Leech Lake Nation, the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And it's well documented that acutely polluted sites are often found or even cited in low-income communities of color. My question for you, John, is it a coincidence that this happened in the Leech Lake Nation?
I don't know that I have a real good answer for that. I think it's not a coincidence that this happened in the heart of forestry. This is a Chippewa National Forest, and there's, where we live up here in northern Minnesota, there's a lot of logging. And so there's been forest products industries, throughout our area. So I don't think that's out of the ordinary. I would offer to you that I think if this was in Burnsville, it would have been cleaned up a long time ago. I think it's the cleanup that is out of the ordinary, and why U.S. EPA, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, doesn't just order for it to be cleaned up in 10 years or 20 years is beyond me. And we don't even have a projection of cleanup date for the groundwater. They just aren't pumping and treating enough groundwater to get it cleaned up in probably even the next century. It's perplexing to me. Because
please.
Yeah, well, it's just a real serious contamination issue, and the source material that needs to be removed to accommodate a more reasonable, quicker groundwater treatment, groundwater cleanup to drinking water standards. That's where where the tribe wants to go with this. That's where this and the state has weighed in here over the years to get to drinking water quality, and it's going to take a lot more effort to do that. And one of the concerns that has recently arisen in the way the Superfund law is constructed, and the Superfund law was basically written by industry attorneys. This is I'll say it's my conjecture, but I know enough to say that I believe that that's true, to limit liability. So, but if there is no responsible party, if the industry that did the polluting is out of business, then that's where the Superfund comes in. And there used to be a small tax on petroleum products and a lot of other toxic substances, potentially toxic substances, that was used then to clean up these sites where there was no. The Superfund was actually a fund gaining money. this small tax on toxic substances. That tax went away, was done away with by Congress. I don't know the exact year, but it was, if memory serves, it was during the Clinton administration. And that's just, so if we don't have, and the fund is well, it's invested in, gain some some interest and gain some funds. Sometimes there's way too many cleanups that need to be done. The fund can't accommodate all that. So it really, one of the concerns that we've had is, so what happens if International Paper goes out of business? I mean, we're talking a century or 2 or 3, we don't know, to clean up the groundwater. Are they going to be around? One of their primary products is paper. What's going on with paper right now? It's not being produced anywhere near the quantities that it was 20 years ago.
Well,
so
that is a perfect segue to my next question, which is about accountability. It's my understanding that the law that you're referencing, the Superfund law, or CERCLA, is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And so therefore, it's supposed to hold polluters accountable. So my question for you is, who's being held to account?
I'll say at this time, EPA, the responsible party, is as identified, and it's actually International Paper and Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. So they're part of it too, because, well, they got brought into it. I think primarily because they hauled in some of the raw product, the forest product, and they hauled out some of the finished product. Now that's my interpretation of why they're named a responsible party, but that's what I believe happened. That's what I've read, that how I believe they got named a responsible party. But primarily it's International Paper that's on the hook for the cleanup. And International Paper bought this, bought Champion International, who had bought out St. Regis Wheeler Corporation. I didn't tell that part of the story, but it was St. Regis Wheeler Corporation that did the actual wood treatment. And so this liability, as it were, has changed hands several times. And now International Paper has this significant liability, and they bought it. They knew what they were buying.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So as they acquired St. Regis, they also acquired the responsibility for cleaning this up. All right,
yes.
So let's talk about the cleanup. How exactly do you mitigate this? Do you have to remove a certain volume of soil? Can you tell us the mechanics of that process?
Yes, as you indicated, well, and there's an identification process, an assessment process, what's contaminated, how contaminated is it, particularly with soils and groundwater, and some of the resources in the even aquatic resources. We know there are significant, greater than background, significant, for instance, significant contamination in the whitefish in Cass Lake and Pike Bay. Now, and I didn't say this, but I'll say dioxin, and it's dioxin contamination. I'm just going to use the word dioxin in a general context for all the dioxin and furan congeners that I talked about. But dioxin contamination is in whitefish in greater quantity than other fish, because whitefish are a fatty fish, and dioxin is lipophilic, which means that dioxin adheres to fat. And so if you were to look at any critter out there, including human beings, you'd find that dioxin, if there was any, in the fat primarily. So we know that the fish, for instance, in Cass Lake and Pike Bay, all have some dioxin, but it's primarily in the whitefish, and in fish eggs. Fish eggs are a lot of fat in fish eggs, and we've looked there and we found that. So wherever the dioxin and or penachlorphenol. There's penachlorphenol here too, and it's a fairly bad news chemical in and of itself, causing many of the same potential medical issues. So identifying, doing investigations to identify what's in the groundwater, what's in the soils, and then coming up with a remedy, removing soils and sludges that were particularly problematic. And I said early on, creosote was part of this. There's still creosote in areas, in some sludges in some areas of the site that was never removed, primarily because it's saturated soil. I mean, it's in the groundwater, but soil that's saturated. So the easiest to remove is just soil that's above the groundwater, and that was done. It's been done several times. It's proposed to do it again in another area. We give EPA gives these areas of the site labels to identify, and they're called operable units. So we've got a handful of operable units at the site. And
that's a very misleading term. It doesn't suggest that it's toxic. And unfortunately, we only have about a minute left, John.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I ask two more questions.
Yeah.
One of which is, if you move this hazardous waste, isn't it just going to create a problem elsewhere? I mean, is simply moving the waste actually addressing the problem briefly?
The waste, any waste above a certain threshold has to go to a facility that is licensed to handle that. And the only way that we know to get dioxin out of soil is to combust it at very high temperatures. And there is a safe way to do that. But I believe, if memory serves, it's Illinois is the closest facility to do that. There are several in the United States also that soil would have to be shipped. So it's complex. It's not easy. Dioxin is a very problematic, if not one of the most problematic contaminants that we know of.
That sounds like a Herculean effort to address this. And in the very little time we have left, John, I want to understand a little bit about your motivation. So what lessons can we learn from the work that you've done for 41 years with the Leech Lake Nation, with this specifically? What lessons can you share with our viewers and frankly, the rest of the country in terms of how to address, or more importantly, prevent this from happening elsewhere?
Right. Fortunately, we do have environmental laws and regulations put into place, including the Leech Lake Nation. They have their Hazardous Substance Control Act, which I was proudly part of helping to get into place in the early 2000s. So we need to be very aware that we have the environmental laws, and by and large, environmental laws can work. Clean Water Act, federal and state and tribal, for instance, and Clean Air Act and those kind of things. So we have those laws and regulations, so we need to make sure that we don't let administrations such as we're seeing here now at the federal level do away with regulations, which they have done. We need to work on getting those regulations back. That's it. That is a big charge for all of us.
Well, John, I want to thank you so much for the work that you've done on behalf of all of us, frankly. And I want to thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Jason. Wonderful to talk with you.
And I want to thank all of you for joining me once again. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Be kind and be well. We'll see you next week.